The church was made up mostly of Greeks, of Gentiles, with some Jews. You see, diversity in the congregation is nothing new today. We think that's a modern day thing. Paul had diversity 2,000 years ago. And right here, Paul attempts to get the church back on that right track and unify that divided church with the message of the cross. Romans 10:12, we're back in Romans, tells us that there is no difference between Jews and the Gentile. The same Lord is the Lord of all. Now this is pertaining to everlasting life. This says that all must accept the message of the cross. It does not matter if you are homeless and literally grew up on the streets. It doesn't matter if you grew up in some of the finest homes in the state. It still applies. Jesus Christ is Lord of all. The message of the cross is the same for both. And I want to tell you that both the Jews and the Gentiles have baggage, don't we all? Anyone here got baggage? The Jews and the Gentiles have baggage when it comes to accepting Jesus as paying the price for our sin. Their religious belief and background was varied. You see, the Greeks always sought wisdom for their enlightenment. You may have a conversation with a Greek and make a theological point. And that Greek would say, that's very interesting. Someone else says this. Another writer says this or that. The Jews, on the other hand, were always looking for a sign from heaven to confirm what was being said. You remember all throughout the ministry of Jesus, the Jewish leaders always asking Jesus for a sign. You'll also remember that he refused. He never did do that. Christ crucified was a stumbling block to the Jews. Christ crucified was foolishness for the Greeks and the Gentiles. It was foolish to even consider that. You see, they were still looking for that warrior Messiah, not a person crucified like a common criminal. Paul was determined to unify all this diversity with Christ and the message of the cross. I want to talk to you about crucifixion. Crucifixion was a terrible form of capital punishment. Today, people see the cross as a beautiful piece of jewelry. But not back then. 2,000 years ago, it symbolized a terrible death. Death on the cross was the sentence given to high-profile criminals. Crucifixion was very slow. Crucifixion was very agonizing. This public, very slow execution was used as an example. This was to say to the public, don't do what this person did, or you could be hanging here next week. So we have on this ledger, if you could imagine this ledger, on one side we have both the Jews and the Greeks. We have people looking for religious signs from heaven, and we have people looking for wisdom for their enlightenment. Now, first of all, stop and think about that. How can you argue with either one of those? Sign from heaven and wisdom. It seems so right. It seems so logical. Of course, that's what we want. But on the other side of that ledger, we have a man who was crucified. He was crucified and died on a cross. To the wise, this seems foolish to even consider. When man uses the logic of his mind to weigh this out and try to figure out God, he will get into trouble every single time. Oftentimes people think they might submit to God as soon as they can figure him out. You see, they want God to fit into their minds before they will let him fit into their lives. Those who are perishing today are much like the Greeks, and they see no wisdom in the cross. Those who are perishing today are much like the disciple Thomas, who needed more proof that Jesus Christ actually was raised from the dead. Oddly enough, I have found myself on both the side of the Jews and the side of the Greeks. I remember thinking about Jesus dying on that cross, and then miraculously, 3 days later, God raising him from the dead. Well, surely that has to be a sign from heaven. Surely this has to be our guy. This has to be the Messiah. And then I remember delving deeper into the whole crucifixion account and thinking about all that Jesus went through. Thinking about those 39 lashes with that whip with shards of glass and metal coming down 39 times on his back. I think of that crown of thorns being pressed down hard upon his head. I think of the nails in his feet and hands. I think of the spear in his side. I think of him dying on that cross, knowing that that should be me. That's my sin that he's dying for, and went through all of that for me. And then God miraculously raising him from the dead 3 days later, and I say to myself, is that even possible? There's the Greek. Friends, if it was possible, it wouldn't be a miracle. Jesus Christ paid the price for my sin and gained victory over death. I join him in his death. I join him in his resurrection. Science can't explain that. Proverbs 16:25 tells us, there's a way that seems right unto man, but in the end, it leads to death. Here, the Greeks, with their prideful reasoning out of any situation, and the Jews, with their rich history of religious faith, could make no sense of salvation through a crucified one. But God has made foolish the wisdom of the world. God's foolishness is wiser than the highest human wisdom. Let me tell you a story about an American scientist, George Washington Carver. He's a Christian man, had a sign in his laboratory that said, God's little workshop. One day he was praying, and he said this, Dear Mr. Creator, please tell me why the universe was created. Wow. That's quite a request. Can you imagine, if you knew the answer to that, how many other questions you would have the answer to? And you'd be interested to know that God responded to this prayer request. And he said, little man, you ask too much. You would never understand that. Ask for something more suitable to your puny little mind. Puny? You know, I don't know about you, but whenever I hear the word scientist associated with a person's name, I just know that that person is very smart. That person understands things that I don't even think about. But unoffended, George Washington Carver asked a second question. He said, Dear Creator, please tell me why man was formed and created. God answered him again. And he said, "You're still asking too much. Cut down the extent of your request and improve the intent." So the scientists asked a third question. He said, "Well then, Mr. Creator, please tell me why the lowly peanut was created." And God said, "That's better." And starting that day, George Washington Carver found over 300 uses for the lowly peanut. Verse 25 of today's text tells us that the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom. You see, man thinks he's wise, but he has no idea. Man's most profound thought does not even compare with God's simplest thought. There was a time in our history when the wisdom of the world said that the world was flat. There was a time in our history when they would say, if there is a solar system, the earth is the center of that solar system, and the sun and all the planets revolve around earth. If you were to say, I think that the world is round, you would have been called a fool. If you would have said, well, I think actually the earth and the other planets all revolve around the sun, you would have been called foolish indeed. 5 times in 8 verses here, Paul uses the word foolish or foolishness. The Greek word for this is morai. The English translation, moron. It means stupid. It means ignorant. The simplest of God's thoughts are wiser than the most profound thoughts of the wise. When man can't understand a thought or reason, he calls that thought or reason foolishness. You see, the message of the cross is not simply good advice or helpful information. It's the power of God. Our victory, our salvation, can only be attained through the cross. You see, to the Christian, the cross is everything. So let me divide today's talk into 3 sections here. I call it my 3 whats. The what, the so what, and the what now. The what is, man is a sinner, and he's perishing. The so what is that God has provided a way of atonement, the cross. And the what now is a question. So what will you do? Will you risk being seen as a fool by telling people who are perishing about the way of the cross? You see, folks, every Christian I know, at one point in their life, they were in darkness. They were perishing. Once we are saved, we have a choice to make. Once we are saved, we can say, I'm saved. I'm just going to sit back and wait for Jesus to call me home. Or you can look around. You can see people that are still in darkness. You can see people that are still perishing and reach out to them and tell them about the way of the cross. We can risk being called a fool for believing that message of the cross. What will you do? Amen.